Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Colonel Bruce Vidal, Director of Public Affairs for Air Force Global Strike Command. Before we turn it over to General Bussier, just wanted to orient you to a few things. First of all, we have some briefers here, as you saw on the opening slide. We're going to start with opening remarks from General Bussier, then we'll turn it over to our Air Force Surgeon General, Colonel Coleman, followed by our Air Force A4 Director of Logistics and Engineering, Brigadier General Miller. Then Colonel Tori Woodard, our USAF SAM commander, who's been running the studies out in the field, will speak to that. We'll kind of walk you through the process that got us to this point. Then we will open it up for questions and answers, followed by closing comments from General Bussier. We have ample time for questions and answers. A couple of things on that. We do expect members of the news media to be part of this today. So if you do not feel comfortable necessarily asking a question in this forum that could potentially end up being quoted by the media or shared when we post this broadcast to our website and our YouTube page after, we have a phone number that you can text your question to, and we will keep you anonymous. That number is 318-532-1214. If you text your question, a member of our team will submit that question in the chat room as an anonymous question. So that option is available to you. If you would like to ask a question, you can virtually raise your hand, and you do that by, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little heart emoji that says reactions. If you click on that or mouse over it, there's a raise hand option. Once you're acknowledged, we will call on you, and then we'll unmute the microphone, or you unmute the microphone to ask your question. Lastly, if we do run out of time for Q's and A's, you can always at any time submit through our QR code, which you'll find on the Missile Community Cancer website, on our social media pages. You can send a question through either the Missile Community Cancer website, the Air Force Medical Service website, or the Global Strike website. And those questions, we receive those questions frequently, and we post most of them to the frequently asked questions on the Missile Community Cancer website. In some cases, it's a specific question. We will have one of our medical professionals get back to you individually if it's more of a one-on-one type question. And then lastly, just want to again remind you about the Missile Community Cancer website, which is a treasure trove of resources. It has covered every town hall that we've conducted to this point. It's posted all of the slides from all of those town halls, as well as the reports from the USAF SAM's studies out in the field, all of the executive summaries of those studies. And again, there's a very robust frequently asked questions section there. So again, thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to General Bussier. Sir.
Thanks, Bruce. And thanks to everyone for dialing in for today's really our first public platform town hall meeting. As many of you know, we've done several town halls over the last year and a half internal to the Air Force. But we thought it was appropriate to expand that just past our public facing portal, as well as our articles and interviews, to be able to give interested parties outside the department, either separated retired members or members of the press, the opportunity to get additional context and information. Additional thanks. I want to start by thanking Danny Seebeck, Colonel Seebeck, I'm sure is probably on the line. About a year and a half ago, his discovery journey within the missile operations career field, and the unfortunate spike in what we've seen in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in our missile operators, specifically at Maelstrom. In fact, I think today, based on Danny's update, I think we have 19 Maelstrom missileers from 1997 to 2007 that have been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And if it wasn't for Danny's initiative and persistence, I think we might be delayed in our ability to understand the missile community cancer issue, and then do what we can to mitigate exposure and risk, but just as important, make sure that our members and their families have the appropriate situational awareness and benefits available to them as appropriate. I'd also like to thank my team here at Global Strike Command, Colonel Coleman and his team, as well as Brigadier General Miller and his team, as well as my legal team and my public affairs team, for everything they've done in the last year and a half to work with the Air Force's School of Aerospace Medicine and Colonel Woodward. It has been a team effort to get after this. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank the Secretary and the Chief for their unbounded support for this effort to make sure that we get after what is going on in our missile fields and then take care of our airmen and their families. Many of you have heard this before, but I'll reiterate it just for the folks that haven't been part of this process. Air Force Global Strike Command and the Air Force is dedicated to figuring out what's going on and addressing and mitigating the risks as we discover it. We're also laser focused on making sure that we care for our airmen and their families. And I will tell you, it's personal to all my commanders in the field. It's personal to my deputy commander sitting to my right, and it's personal to me because we all have experience over our lifetimes and our careers with dealing with the various different levels and aspects of cancer, both inside the department and outside the department. And so from a personal perspective, Captain Boussier dealt with cancer in a different career field. In our Air Force and our department approached that and published a report in February of 2022, the top 20 cancers affecting fighter aviators in the Department of Defense. And my personal experience with that was number 2 on the list in that report. I also had many friends and colleagues back in the 90s that had experienced different forms of cancers. And I believe it's our obligation to completely understand the environment we ask our airmen to operate in and do what we can to mitigate any risk or exposure. The other thing I'd offer to you is motivating for me personally is the fact that if you have a son or daughter serving in the military, it provides a slightly different perspective. But I'd offer to you, like I've told my commanders in the past, that every one of our airmen deserve to be treated as if they were someone's son or daughter, because they are someone's son or daughter. And they volunteered to serve this nation. So we have an obligation to make sure we understand and mitigate any risk when we ask them to do that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Colonel Coleman, and we'll run through the update for everybody online, and then we welcome your conversation or questions.
All right. Thank you, sir. And good morning to all. I'm Colonel Greg Coleman, Command Surgeon here at Air Force Global Strike Command. And again, thank you all for joining us this morning. And from the beginning, when missileers brought forth the initial potential link between non-Hodgkin lymphoma at Malmstrom and their service, we remained transparent and committed to the safety of our missileers and the missile community. In line with that commitment today, we want to walk through the missile community cancer study that we've been ongoing for the last 15 months, and then share with you where we plan to go in the future. Next slide. All right. So this study is run by the School of Aerospace Medicine and was developed in consultation with the VA as well as the National Cancer Institute. And it has 2 arms or 2 parts to the study. The first is the epidemiology review that looks to compare the 14 common cancers in the general population with those that we found in the missile-related career fields. That encompasses data that goes back to 1976 and captures about 84,000 missile community members. The second part is the environmental sampling, which is really 3 distinct rounds of sampling to capture any seasonal variation as they look at contaminants, hazards, and chemicals, things like organic phosphates and volatile organic compounds are capturing that, looking at air, water, soil, and radon sampling. And so we'll get into more details about the epidemiology review and the environmental sampling portion of that as we go throughout the presentation. But early in the as we were working to develop the study, we were able to do a couple of things to help with the safety of our airmen. One was to cease some burning activities that were happening within the launch control centers. Others were updating our hazard signs for RF, but as well as changing the parking arrangements so that we didn't have running vehicles near the air intakes of buildings. With regard to the environmental sampling, we've completed 2 rounds of environmental sampling already. In the first round, we did find that there were 4 out of 900 surface swipe samples for polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, that were above the EPA's threshold for cleanup. And so, in keeping with the safety of our airmen, those facilities were immediately closed until they could be cleaned and mitigated. So far, the USAF-SAM has been able to complete phase 1 alpha of the epidemiology review, and we'll get into details about that and then what's to come in 1 Bravo. But through all of this, we've remained transparent in our engagement, both on the Bissell Community Cancer website and also with our stakeholders. We've talked with our veteran service organizations like the Association for Air Force Missileers. We say monthly conversations with them, but as well as the VA, so with their interest in the study, specifically the Military Environmental Exposure Subcouncil that looks at toxic exposures in the military environment. So with that as a broad overview and summary, I want to transition now into specifics about the environmental sampling portion and share that with Colonel Woodard and his team at USAF-SAM.
Hey, good morning, General Boussier, team, assembled guests. Appreciate the opportunity to describe to you what we've been working very hard on over the last year and a half here at USAF-SAM and with our partners with Global Strike. As you know, this is one of the largest studies of its type that we've ever done. We had previously been involved in the aviator cancer study, but this is a totally different one. Talking with the VA, this is the first really DoD study that has combined looking at AFGSC data along with base location or location of operational activities. So amazing efforts due in part to our great partnerships. We're over 1 year into this now, and we'll try and provide some brief updates. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So as many of you know, this started really with initial site visits in February of 2023. USAF-SAM did not honestly have a lot of knowledge. Many of our experts from public health and bioenvironmental engineering and occupational medicine had never been out to the missile sites. And so it started with site visits to all the 3 sites. And then that allowed us to come back to analyze what we had learned and then to decide how we were going to move forward and to build our study design, which was ultimately supported and approved by Air Force leadership. And those 2 halves of that, as Colonel Coleman discussed, are the environmental sampling efforts and then the epidemiology study. At the end of all this, we will merge all of this data that we have and provide that information back as a part of a risk assessment. But also we believe that we're increasing the medical knowledge and the environmental health knowledge that will help people make decisions in the future, both about their individual healthcare, whether they are currently serving or formerly serving, but it will also help us make good environmental health decisions about what we do going forward and how we look at things in the past. So going over the environmental sampling results, I'm happy to say that we have now finished at least the sampling or collection of samples for all 3 rounds. Our team is just currently finishing up at Minot and will be headed home this weekend. And that will complete our 3 rounds of the seasonal variations, looking for those seasonal variations at the sites. The first 2 rounds of environmental sampling, as well as from our visit to Vandenberg, those results are complete and they're available on the Bissell Community Cancer site. But overall, I want to highlight that our sampling efforts resulted in the collection of over 8,300 individual lab samples across the 3 bases. That represents about 110,000 or a little less than 110,000 data points that we can utilize because we perform multiple analytes or multiple analysis on each one of those samples. As discussed previously, our sampling plan across the 3 rounds was there looking for seasonal variations in use of industrial, occupational, environmental, and local chemicals or potential contaminants that might be in the environment. And some of those do fluctuate with use depending on the season, so it allowed us to look at those. We looked at over 160 total chemicals to evaluate the risk across multiple routes of exposure, such as inhalation, dermal, or ingested. We tested a full range of air, water, soil, indoor air quality, and swipe samples. Overall, we looked for PCBs, nitrites, nitrates, pesticides, volatile organic compounds, organophosphates, and radon, among other potential contaminants. And we not only looked at the LTCs, but also based on feedback, we looked at the missile procedure trainers at the bases as part of our round 2 sampling, as well as multiple maintenance training areas, LCCs and LFs, when we completed our visit to Vandenberg in February. Overall, the results have consistently shown that the samples that we are collecting are below our laboratory limits of detection or within acceptable national and regulatory standards, which is reassuring. Again, I do want to highlight that when we do this sampling, it is a snapshot in time of what we can do currently. It does give us a peek into the past or potential exposures in the past, but I highlight that this is a look at really what we have going on today, and it helps us develop information and gives us data about today's operating environment. Our round 3 samples have been collected, but they will be a number of weeks before those available, and we'll publicize those as they come. Radon results have now also returned for round 1 and round 2 in Vandenberg. And our radon results, they are calculated using a time-weighted average that accounts for the 24/7 operations in the LCCs and the MAFs. All of these results have come back within acceptable ranges based on the time-weighted average. The results I've just described are obviously with the exception of the PCBs, the swipe samples that Greg talked about, that many of you are aware of. Over the course of the study, we have performed over 1,100 PCB swipe samples. We found detectable levels of PCBs in only 71 of those samples, with only 4 of those being above the EPA levels, cleanup levels, as Colonel Coleman talked about. Those sites were immediately closed and remediation efforts were implemented. I will also want to highlight that at the same time we do swipe samples, we also do air samples for PCBs, and all of our air samples in all of these areas have been non-detectable at any of these sites. Overall, we continue to work with the Air Force Global Strike Command offices and many of our partners, including retired organizations, the VA, academic partnerships, to continue to investigate and develop science-driven strategy for our future efforts. I'll highlight that this environmental sampling is not just a one and done. The environmental sampling will develop and help us understand future efforts of how we monitor our career field in the future. Part of how we got here, it's worth going back a little bit, is that classically we did not perform occupational shop visits for the missileer officers because they were considered an administrative area. And so while our maintainers may have had operational site visits, we did not perform those visits with the missile officers. And that will change going forward as we attempt our efforts will standardize occupational health reporting and analysis going forward. Overall, our goal is to make sure we are protecting today's airmen, but also that we look and provide information and knowledge for those who have served in the past so that they can use that knowledge to seek appropriate care and benefits where appropriate. And I will turn it over back to you, Greg. Thanks.
All right, Colonel, thank you for that. As you're going to walk through that, we want to move to the next slide and really talk about what the ongoing efforts are as related to continue to mitigate some of the PCB exposures and what plans we have at those facilities going forward.
All right, thank you, Colonel Coleman. This is Brigadier General Dave Miller. I'm the Director of Logistics and Engineering for Global Strike Command. We've heard a couple of testimonials today, and I'll add mine. I'm a Missiles and Munitions Maintenance Officer by trade. I've run these missile fields that many of you joining us today have run, both under the Peacekeeper as well as the Minuteman III weapon systems. So let me briefly walk you through the slide to talk about the ongoing efforts we have on the missile field right now. As we've learned over the years, the effects of PCB that went into this weapon system when it was first created, there's been a number of mitigating efforts to modernize and to remove those PCBs from the weapon system. And those were foundational in building not only the training received in the tech schools, but also what has been taught to the team training of the units, as well as really was the foundation for the warnings, notes, and cautions we find in the TOs today and the civil engineering manuals that we use in the field. One of the focus areas we have in the A4 right now, working with USAF SAM, the Surgeon General, as well as the program office, is taking the robust plans that we have and making sure it's standardized across all of our TOs and our civil engineering manuals. And so that is in work at this time. And you'll see the third bullet, or third sub-bullet in the upper left is talking about the signage. Another significant effort we have right now is going out and identifying all of the locations, and right now the LCCs and in the LFs, and going out and marking all of the locations, not only where there are still PCBs, but where there are PCBs in the past, actually marking those so that it's aware to everybody, and then ensuring that those are also cataloged and marry up with what is inside our TOs and our engineering manuals. With that, if you take your attention to the lower left-hand portion, you'll see a diagram of what one of the launch control centers looks like. And you see little stickers on there, little color codes of all the different areas that we go into the field with Surgeon General and testing for PCBs, for residue or for location of PCBs. And in full transparency, we've listed on there all of the locations we'd be going to take a look at. Now, if I take your attention just to the lower right, if you slide across, I want to talk just the last couple of minutes, talk about the environmental upgrades that we have and a couple of deep cleaning contracts that we have in progress. So as we continue to modernize and sustain this incredible weapon system, there are two deep cleaning contracts I want to talk about. The first is, many of you are familiar with the attention we've put to the non-weapon system portions of the LCCs. And this has been done over the years at a unit-funded, wing builds the contracts and builds the pieces that are going to be taken a look at and cleaned in those contracts. We're centralizing that here at the headquarters and to make sure that we have a standardized, deep clean, janitorial, sanitation type process for the important non-weapon system portions of the LCCs out in the field, so we can ensure standardized care is going to all of the different units. In addition to that, what we're building is we're painstakingly spending a lot of time building periodic maintenance requirements for the weapon system components inside the LCCs. This is being worked into a -6 regular requirements that'll afford the teams in the field to know that we have maintainers going out on a periodic basis and looking not only to make sure that we have no areas of detection we need to be concerned about, to make sure the signage is properly located in all the right locations, and just again to offer that assurance that we are continuing to focus on this. Now, as we move from the LCCs into the launch facilities, and as you can see on the slide, we're targeting this between July and September. We're working again with the program office and USAF SAM and the Surgeon General's office here to build a sample of locations out in the missile field. It's going to be, as of the current plan right now, we're going to look at 2 launch facilities in each of the squadrons, at each of the wings, assess that data to take a look at, are we targeting all the right areas before we go out to the rest of the locations to sample. And so we've got the finalized requirements going through the vetting process right now, and we're targeting to be able to start this in the July timeframe. With that, Greg, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And if you take a look at that image there, as we on the top right, where it shows all the previous locations, I think it's important to note that while we have we're doing samplings at the 3 missile wings now, that we understand that there are a lot of previous locations where many people online might have served, and while we're unable to sample those locations, the information that we are able to gather at least gives us a peek into what might have been there in the past. So we can go to the next slide. One of the questions that we receive quite often is, how do I have, what's the hazard documentation, or how do I get this documented in my records? And so the first thing I would offer is, if you believe that you developed a health condition due to an exposure, we ask that you immediately go see your healthcare provider. That's the first step. For our veterans, or those who are for our veterans and those that may be continuing to serve but not necessarily in the missile field today, we recently released a memo addressing PCBs that really says that we recognize the continued presence despite comprehensive removal efforts in the 90s. And that memo is available again on our missile community website. And we also shared that with the Association of Air Force Missileers and with the VA. So just for that continued knowledge on that hazard documentation. If you're currently serving and getting ready to separate or retire, we ask that during your separation health and physical exam that you share that information with that provider to make sure that that becomes part of the record before you retire or separate. But as Colonel Woodard had mentioned previously, what we're currently doing now and throughout the missile community is we're doing a comprehensive hazard risk assessment and loading all of that information in the Defense Occupational Environmental Health Readiness System, or DOORS. Previously, our missileers were not captured in that data. We are adding all the entire missile community, to include missileers, into this database that will have a complete look at all the hazards in the area. That's being done by the local bioenvironmental engineering team. That's the first portion, and they will do individual interviews with shop supervisors, as well as then load all the individuals in that work center into the DOORS system. That'll give a comprehensive look by individual of any potential risk exposures that they would have. In addition, the 100,000 or greater, the sampling that USAF-SAM is doing, that information will also be entered into DOORS, and they are categorizing that by location, so they know where they took a particular sample, at what missile alert facility, and so forth. All of that complete information will get captured in DOORS. The DOORS system then connects to the individual longitudinal exposure record, which is known as ILR. Right? And that is visible to all of our DoD and our VA medical professionals now. We're working with the Defense Health Agency to allow individuals to have access to that information. Right now, we're on target for 2025 to be able to have that access for the individual to log in there and see those potential exposures for themselves. Another thing that we're working with them on is in the deployed environment, currently, if you're at an OCONUS environment, the hazard location is connected to your particular service, to where you might have been. And that is not actually true on the CONUS side. So we're working to connect those pieces. So the information that we're loading into the DOORS system that shows that particular location, Malmstrom or Minot or FE Warren, can be connected to the individual as well in the CONUS. And so DHA is working with us on that. And so those are the 3 to 4 areas where we are working hard to ensure that we could capture hazard documentation for our members, whether they're serving now or have served in the past, and continue that partnership with the VA to capture that workload for our veterans. And so that really kind of rounds out a lot of the environmental sampling portion of what we've done so far. We'll move next to the epidemiology portion of the study.
Great. Thanks again, Greg. Appreciate it. So Colonel Woodard here back again. So we'll describe that epidemiology review. To set this up, we worked very closely with AFGSC, the Air Force Global Strike Command, Air Force Global Strike Command historian, 20th Air Force, and others to help develop the list you see on the left is really a partial list of AFSCs that are involved, not only the missile officers or operators, but also the entire missile community. My background as an occupational medicine physician and a family medicine physician was that as we started this, we were worried not only about just the missile officers, but the entire missile community of people that were working in there. And I will say it is personal to us at USAF-SAM as well. We have a number of people that were prior missileers or missile officers, as well as family members and some of our enlisted that are going out and doing these samples. They grew up on these bases as the children of missile maintainers. And so we do have a personal interest in this as well. So as we looked at this, we worked with AFGSC and others, we came down to a cohort of really looking at almost 2.2 million records across the DoD system, beneficiaries, and then focusing it down to roughly 84,000 members of the missile community, including 8,000 operators or missileers. Initially, what we're doing is looking at the data. We published phase 1A data a little bit earlier this year, and that was a look at our electronic military medical records and people who were seen in the military treatment system. We recognize that the electronic military record really didn't start until the early 2000s in the DoD. And then we went through people who had served through starting really in 1976 and then up through the years of 2010 with data collection out to 2020. The reason we did this and we stopped at people who came in previous to 2010 is we worked with the National Institute and others to develop a cancer study. Commonly in a cancer study, you use a 10-year exposure period after exposure for development of cancer. And that's what we use based on their estimates. It went out to 2020 because when we started this in 2023, we only had national data available through 2020. It takes about 2 to 3 years for National Cancer Institute and others to compile all their data and collect all their data to prepare their cancer statistics. So that is why we went through 2020. The other thing I'll point out as well is if you look at a bunch of people who came into the Air Force after 2020, you would be looking at a bunch of young, healthy people who may not have had the exposure. The exposure of interest we were really looking at is those that may have been in the missile community in the early 90s, but as well as a larger population. Currently, we are working on phase 1B and phase 1C because these are larger data sets that include data from the VA, National Cancer Institute, the DoD Cancer Registry to look at data and captures. We get called a lot from people asking how they can be part of the missile study, whether their data or whether their cancer is included in that study. So we use these multiple overlapping databases as seen here that occur over different periods of time to try and capture all of those cases. We understand not everybody retired and not everybody was seen in the military health system. So that initial data that we published in 1A, we believe is very limited, probably potentially less than 25% of our cancer cases that we're interested in. So we use these multiple overlapping databases that capture people who would have separated and are seen off base, or maybe they're seen in the VA system. And our future will include phase 2, which is where we get virtual pooled registry, which is where we pull cancer statistics from a pooled data of 45 different states. What we are learning from that, and that will be a little bit delayed, probably into 2025, is that it takes us months and months and months to get that data from those multiple states. And we've learned that through the aviator cancer study and others over the last year, that one takes a little bit longer than we had initially thought. Our phase 1B and 1C we will publish, and we estimate that those will be available sometime this fall. Next slide, please. As discussed, we did previously publish our 1A results. Again, it's a little bit abnormal for us to publish results in the middle of a large study, but in the efforts of transparency and full disclosure, we wanted to talk about what we were finding at that time, as well as discuss the limitations of the data that we were looking at that I just described. Again, we realized this is only a partial list of data, a list of cases, and those only seen within the military treatment center in the time period that we were looking at. Overall, the results from the limited portion of our data did not show an increased rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at this time, But again, we were going to keep digging into these other data sets to look, because we realize that many of the cases that are being reported to us are those not seen within the military treatment center or not seen among those who are still serving. And so we'll continue to dig and evaluate this initial data to make sure we provide the answers that we're looking for. The initial data review did suggest potentially increased rates of breast and prostate cancer, though. This is actually similar to other recently national publicized studies showing higher rates of breast and prostate cancer in the population receiving care in the military system. Breast and prostate cancer are the two of the most common cancer diagnoses in the US, and we are certainly seeing increased rates across the country, but also in certain military populations. We do know that through our studies and other studies that are out there for the last couple of years, there are certainly cancers that are specifically increased within the military population, or sometimes we don't have an answer why that is, but we know they're there, such as melanoma in the aviator cancer study, which is why we continue to look at these. What we don't know is whether these recent upticks in breast and prostate cancer are due to increased screening and the care that our beneficiaries can receive within the military system, which is sometimes better than their peers on the outside, or whether these are due to unique military exposures. There is medical research to suggest that increased access to care may result in earlier cancer diagnosis and better outcomes. And we know that our military and prior population is part of this, that has access to care as part of their retired benefits. So it's a little bit unique, and we have to consider this when we look at these rates. Going forward, we will continue to look at all of the data that is available to us. We're working with our partners. We're continuing to work with the VA. We're continuing to work with other partners such as the CDC, National Institutes of Health, to review our data, as well as civilian academic partners to make sure that we have outside look and peer review of this data as we get ready to release our results this summer. So again, thanks for everybody's support on this. We'll continue to put data out through Air Force Global Strike Command as we get this, and I'll turn it back over to Greg at this point in time.
All right. Thanks, Tori. If we could go to the next slide. And before we move on to the questions portion of today's town hall, just a little bit on the way forward. So we'll complete the environmental sampling as Colonel Woodard discussed. The actual sample taking is completed. Now we're just waiting for all the data to come back, and then we'll publish that report. And in that sampling is a reminder to look at organic phosphates and volatile organic compounds that also account for any pesticides that might have been around the area of those missile alert facilities as folks had served. And then do the comprehensive health risk assessments, and that will get wrapped up as well into the Defense Occupational Environmental Health Readiness System, or DOORS, that we talked about before, and that'll inform future risk exposures for those that are serving. And then we'll move forward with the launch facility sampling as well. Continue the epidemiology review, as Colonel Woodard discussed, and then we'll also be continuing all of our engagements with other stakeholders, in particular the VA and the Military Exposure Sub-Council and their connection with our PACT Act representatives to ensure that we're outlining what's happened in the study, and so that they can do those toxic exposure assessments for our veterans. There's links on there for you to read more about the PACT Act, but also for you to access the Missile Community Cancer Study website, where again, we have a lot of information about the study, the articles, and the reports that we pushed out, and the QR code where you can access and ask any question that you might have, and we'll be able to respond to you individually as we go through that. So I think that covers what we had planned for the presentation portion for today, and then we can open up now and begin the question portion of what's on set for today.
Yeah, so before we as we get ready for the questions, I just want to kind of give a couple more thoughts as the team has gone through the study as it is right now. So, I mean, my perspective is we have an obligation really to kind of do three big things. First obligation is to make sure that we completely understand the risk and exposure of the current force out in the fields of our three missile wings, in the Minuteman III weapon system as they perform the nation's most important mission. And the team is really doing a phenomenal job getting down to that with this study. The second thing that I think was probably of great interest to this forum on this town hall is having a deeper understanding and documenting the potential exposure based on what we learn in this study with the service in prior missile fields that or squadrons that no longer exist. Although we can't exactly understand the exposure because those facilities are closed or archived or destroyed, we will be able to have a macro level understanding based on the technical orders and the construction and the design of those facilities, so that we can have an understanding of what potential exposure our prior operators, maintainers, and potential defenders might have been exposed to. And that's another thing that this study is focused on. And then to Greg and Tori's point is establishing a mechanism to document any potential exposure and environmental risk for our airmen, so that if there is a health concern in the future, that we actually have documentation in a system that archives that for the benefit of our members and their families in the future. So before we open it up, again, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank our team and the team down at the School of Aerospace Medicine. Thank the continued support from members in DC, as well as our congressional leadership teams. And thank the partnership for the Veterans Administration for everything they're doing to help us work through the bureaucracy for taking care of our service members and their families. So I'll turn it back over to Bruce and the team to start facilitating the Q&A.
Thank you, sir. We do have several questions that have been submitted via chat. That is the easiest way to submit questions if you still want to do so. Otherwise, you can raise your hand. Going down the list of what we have, sir, first question. I know the focus is on cancer, as it should be, but with all of our exposures on alert, what other conditions are being looked at? I was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and I know my sleep issues started while on alert back in 2010, 2011.
So I mean, I can give my personal opinion. Does any medical professional want to address that question?
So I'll start. I think what we're continuing to learn is while this study is particularly looking at the increase in potential cancers for the service in the missile field, what we also are doing is, as we gather all of the information as it comes in, we'll be looking for what other things that we might need to go evaluate as we go forward. And so we have not looked at that yet. We're not to that stage, but if there's something else as we come through the study that needs us to look at a different aspect or look at a different portion of the study, we plan to go forth and do that.
Yeah, Tori, I'm not sure if you have any comment on that.
Yes, sir. Thanks. Yeah, that is outside the scope of the study at this point in time. But I'll highlight everything that we're doing is to build knowledge so that our current, former, and past people who served can take the knowledge that we have generated and go and have individual discussions with their medical provider. Then they can discuss fully their personal, their family medical history, their occupational and environmental history and potential risks, so that their doctor can make individually informed decisions about cancer screening and medical care. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is make sure people get the best medical care that they can using that knowledge. Over.
Thanks, Tori. I guess the only thing I'd add to your comments and Greg's comments is kind of agnostic on the concern or topic, but if anybody has an operational or medical concern as it relates to service in this career field, don't minimize or marginalize it. Let's bring it up to your healthcare provider or your chain of command, and we'll take each one on head on. Over.
All right, sir. Our next question is, has anyone looked at sodium chromate exposure that was used in GNC coolant when I was a targeting officer at Ellsworth Air Force Base in the early 1970s?
This is Lieutenant Colonel Boyd at USAF SAM. We have looked at all the occupational site visits that have been performed at the base level between Minot, Malmstrom, and FE1 Air Force Base, and have discovered that all the bases and bioshops have identified the use of sodium chromate in the shops there. So it is actually, at this point in time, documented indoors.
Yeah,
Okay.
as part of the total information that we're gathering, when we don't have all the information from both the environmental study, the risk analysis, and the epidemiology study, once we combine those two, it will help us classify risks, and we'll be able to maybe further identify some of those things. Again, this is where we knew that some of the maintainers were utilizing those sodium chromate, and it was documented in their records, and there was processes to deal with that, versus where the missile officers, they didn't have any shop visits. So we're trying to pull all that data together to build a risk analysis, to pull all this information together in the future. Again, all this information will also help us make future decisions to make sure we continue to protect our field going forward, and it may even help drive how we do future visits or how we do future development of the next generation system or Sentinel. Over.
All right, sir, we have several questions from people who were stationed at squadrons and wings that have now been decommissioned. So I'm going to compile them into a single question as best I can. How are we examining exposures and impacts for people who were stationed at installations that we can no longer test at? Over.
Yeah, this is Colonel Woodard. That is a great question, and one we receive a lot. Probably that question, and then how do I become involved in the study? So I just want to reassure people, if you had one of the AFSCs that placed you in the missile community from 1976 going forward, those AFSCs are all involved. It's not just those that worked at our current bases, but it's anybody who worked at our previous bases. I know that there's some, and our team is aware, there's some configurations, especially of the LCCs, that no longer exist. And so what we're doing is, as we compile this information, we'll be able to look back on that and potentially subdivide some of that information to take a look. But to the best of our ability, we're placing individuals, and we're looking at all individuals, no matter where they served during the time range of the study, to make sure that we're capturing those cases and evaluate them. Over.
Hey, so there is a great number and a great concern with members that had served in the 564th Missile Squadron at Malmstrom. Obviously, that squadron closed over a decade ago. We obviously can't test those facilities, but what we can do is have an understanding based on the archived technical orders of what hazards were identified and what actual environment was in those facilities. And that's one thing that we can do that's not a direct test or assessment, is kind of have a historical reference point for what was in those facilities. And then General Lutton has informed me that those facilities were a different configuration than the current LCCs at Malmstrom. So again, that's a consideration that we will look at and document in our study. Over.
All right, we have a few folks who are raising their hands to ask questions. If you are raising your hand and you'd like to speak, just be prepared to activate your mic when I call on you. So first off, we're going to go to Mike Kanalakis, and Jeremy Holmes, you are on deck after him. Mike, you've been asked to unmute your mic. Go ahead and speak if you can. Oh, I'm sorry, Jenny Holmes, not Jeremy. All right, I don't hear anything from. Go ahead,
I'm
Jenny.
so sorry. This is Jenny. Hi. Thank you guys for doing this. I appreciate you opening it up to the public. I'm Jenny Holmes. I'm the wife of Mark Holmes, who passed away in May of 2020 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I just have a couple questions. Can you explain how the cleanup works just in a little more detail? I think I was just confused with if you close and clean up a site, which I mean, thank you, because the whole point of me now, since my husband's passed, my thing is I want to keep people safe. I want to keep these missileers safe and others who are exposed. If you close and clean up a site, but need more tests in the future, how does that work?
Well, good morning, ma'am. Thank you for the question. This is Colonel Coleman, the command surgeon here at Global Strike. And so what we did is we partnered with the team here, our A4 team and 20th Air Force, as well as the understandings from EPA to go through and clean all the sites with PCBs that were above that EPA threshold to within standard. And then as part of periodic reviews and maintenance that our bioenvironmental team will do is to go back and relook at those potential hazards. And if we find that we've exceeded that standard again, those also get cleaned. But I think what General Miller has shared previously is we've gone to execute a contract that will do that periodic cleaning and maintenance to ensure that the facilities stay clear of those hazards.
Thank you. One more question. So I know that, so for me, my husband passed in 2020. He was a reservist, a traditional reservist. And I've been fighting for benefits, and I've had an amazing support system with Danny, and General Boussier even has helped. And so I think what my thing is as somebody who's worked in the medical profession, sometimes it's not just one thing that causes. I know you mentioned like with aviation, melanoma, but the cause was unknown. When do we get to a point where the numbers speak for themselves? The numbers, it's a small community, and the amount of cancers found in this community is just beyond it's common sense to know something that they're being exposed to is causing all these illnesses. When do you guys say the numbers speak for themselves, but we don't really know what's causing it?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that question, Jenny. I appreciate it, and our condolences. Your husband is one of the reasons why we're doing this and why we're looking at this very carefully. So to answer that question, there is a lot of studies going on. There's a lot of exposures. There's a lot of things that we just don't know. What is the effect of sleep? What is the effect of working multiple 24-hour shifts? We know that in firefighters that work shifts, they have increased risks of certain health conditions. We know that there's a lot of things in our environment that we're learning that play into this. What we're continuing to look at with our data is the cases that we get, but also things like the age of diagnosis. Classically, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you think about a male in their 50s to 60s, and we're seeing cases that are a little bit younger. And so as we talk to some of our academic partners, we're trying to figure that out. So as we go to publish this data, what we intend to do is look at the data by age, sex, and race so that some of those individual nuances will stand out. At this point in time, we just don't have the fidelity, or we're not finished looking at that data. I will say that we have had also great partnerships with the VA and some of our academic partners. The PACT Act people have asked Colonel Coleman and I to provide them. We've briefed them. We've briefed the White House staffers, and we continue to regularly, right now it's scheduled for quarterly, to brief the VA's Military Exposure Subcouncil so that they have the most accurate and up-to-date information, and we're sharing the information. I wish we had the results of the phase 1B and 1C, but we're continuing to work those now, and we will publish those. I will caveat that to say that sometimes we don't find the individual exposure. In military populations, these environmental studies, it's rare that we get down to the actual individual exposure that leads to a disease. But what we do is we document a case of workers or a case of a population, and we document that and publicize it so that it's available for those people and the caregivers to help make individual medical decisions. Over.
All right, thank you for your
Thank-
questions. Jenny, oh, go ahead.
Thank you so much for answering my questions.
All right, thank you for those questions. Mike, gonna go back to you. If you're able to unmute, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. My name's Mike Kanalakis, and I'm an old Titan II crew dog. And I appreciate the fact that the Air Force hasn't forgotten us. For those of us who served in the program between 1964 and 1984, there's still a lot of us out here, and a lot of us still have health issues. My question is with regard to the environmental sampling. You are aware, I hope, that there still is a perfectly preserved Titan II missile in Green Valley, Arizona. And is there any possibility that any sampling studies can be done at the old site 571-4? Of course, there's there's no fuel or oxidizer there, but I'm sure that it might be worth investigating. Is that a possibility?
Hey, Mike, this is Tom Boussier. I've actually toured that facility many years ago. We'll take that on. Don't have an answer yet. I think it might be a state museum, but I'm not sure. But we'll take that on. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, it's actually owned by the Pima County Air Museum Society, and our association, the 390th Strategic Missile Wing Memorial Association. We're affiliated with supporting that operation down there. And like I say, there's still a lot of us out here that are wondering if that's something that you guys could take a look at. But thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We actually did that at Oscar One, another museum that's on one of our installations. So thank you for that. We'll take it on.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take another few questions from chat, and then we'll go to folks with their hands raised. For folks with their hands raised, Dan Holmes, you are on deck. We'll get to your question after we take these questions from chat. Sir, the next question from chat is, to what extent are Torchlight Initiative participants' data being folded into Phase 1 Alpha and Phase 1 Bravo epidemiology review? Over.
Yeah, great question. So we are working and we have reviewed that list. We continue to utilize that list from Torchlight to gather our information. We don't individually put those cases into a study. We have a standardized methodology of how we pull the data from the study, meaning we work with AFGSC to generate the AFSCs. We send it to the data. We make the data request. We pull the names. We believe most of those names, again, through our overlapping databases, will be captured, but we do not take individual names from databases and then insert them into the study, because that could potentially induce bias unintentionally that we don't mean to. But we do, we continue to bounce our findings off of those findings to try and assure that we're capturing as many cases as possible. Again, our initial data set from 1 Alpha, we believe it's incomplete and we haven't captured all the cases. And so we will use the Torchlight numbers as we go forward to see how we're doing in capturing those cases. So great question. We have repeated conversations with Torchlight. And so we appreciate their partnership in all this as well. And I hope that answers your question. Over.
All right, Dan Holmes, over to you for your question.
Yes, sir. I'm the father of Major Mark Holmes and Jenny's father-in-law, who you just heard from. And I guess it's frustrating to me, and I just want to know what you're doing specifically with the VA. Jenny submitted a claim to the VA a little over a year after Mark's death, and 3 weeks later, she was denied. Fast forward 16 months, she submitted a second claim in January of 2023 after Danny Seebeck contacted her, and we found out all of this other data had come out. And after 15 months in March of this year, she was denied once again. At the time of his death, Mark's kids were 8, 6, and 2 years old. Maddie is now 12, William is 10, and Anna is 6. Is it going to take many more years for these studies to be conducted before the VA will come on board and recognize that my son's death was, and many others, was service related, which we seem to be impossible to convince them of that fact?
Hey, Dan, I'm not sure, this is Tom Busey. I'm not sure if we have anybody from the VA that would like to address that on the forum.
Dr. Peter Rum.
Okay. Dr. Rum, are you available to answer that question? Over.
Dr. Rum, you
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Can you
do.
hear? Yeah, I just want to say, I would encourage whoever is to continue to stay a process and consider reapplying. But there's an important part of the PAC Act bill called TARA, where if you apply for a disability and you claim you have a possible exposure, they evaluate it for possible, getting you a medical exam, again, the records, and looking deeper at disabilities. That's going on right now. And as has been put out, I think in the news, we are looking at waiting for the results. And as soon as possible, we get the results, the VA will consider the results. And we have a process called where we look at things. And we've been working with the Air Force, this team, quite closely. And as was talked about with briefings and so forth, so we're kind of waiting the results. So I would encourage you, and it never hurts, basically what I'm trying to say, to reconsider and reapply another claim, and or consider getting what's called a TARA evaluation, this thing where at least you may get health care while you're waiting on the other disability. So I think, again, and if anybody, I know there's been some real personal things. I don't want to talk about personal things, but I'll put my email in the chat. If anybody has a particular question, I'll try and get you the right person who benefits or somebody. So to give you the best answer they can.
Well, General Boussier was kind enough to write a letter, and we have appealed the latest denial of her claim. But it seems that this is not going to help other people in our situation until the VA recognizes this, just like Agent Orange in Vietnam, the burn pits in Afghanistan, the water system at Camp Lejeune is a presumptive positive for missileers who served in the Minuteman III system for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and these other cancers. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, we'll go back to another question from chat, and then we will go to folks with their hands raised. Next question is, when will we look at historical data from Titan II? As a former MCCC with kidney tumors, we were constantly exposed to unremediated PCB and asbestos, unknown radon, and toxic substance contamination. And as far as we know, no studies. Is this not as much of a moral and legal obligation as Minuteman III? Over.
This is Colonel Woodard. If you served in those time periods starting in 1976, and why we went to 1976 and why we can only go back that far is that is when AFGSC starts electronic records tracking personnel. Actually, the Air Force has done a better job than some of the sister services, so we can go back a little bit further in the study. So for those that served from 1976 forward, we are including them in the cancer cases, and we will provide that information as part of the study going forward. Over.
Over.
Thank you, sir. Next question is, has the radon study from the 2010-2011 timeframe been found and examined? Paraphrasing a senior leader around the time, the levels were too high, so we threw out the results. Over.
This is Colonel Woodard. We'll have to take that away for action. I'm not sure at which location they're referring to and where that is. So if someone can provide USAF SAM with that information or the Global Strike SG's office, we'll look into that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Most of the other questions are in a similar vein, dealing with people stationed at previous locations. If you have a question you'd like to ask out loud, please raise your hand. We'll unmute you. The final question I'm seeing in the chat that hasn't already been addressed is, while collecting samples, were samples taken from the bottom of the launch tube at the launch facilities? Most contaminants end up at the bottom of the launch tube as water infiltrates the sites, runs down the launch tube walls, and ends up in the sump pump. As maintenance, we had to repair and replace those sumps. Over.
Yeah, that was an excellent question. Appreciate that. This is Brigadier General Dave Miller. And so as I tried to illuminate earlier, we're still in the process of building the requirements to go out there for where in the LFs we're going to search. We can take that under advisement. Familiar with the launch tubes as are you. And so the focus on this has been getting after where the known PCB locations are. We don't want to miss the opportunities to take a look at things that are of concern around the surrounding areas. So we'll take that back with the team and take that under advisement. Thank you.
All right. Next question from the chat. If you are not in the DoD or VA record system, how is the study getting the records, your examples?
Yeah, this is Colonel Woodard. Great question, and I probably didn't clarify that as much. So when we work with AFGSC, they basically generate numbers, and we, through our IRB, or Institutional Review Board, we get de-identified data such as social security number and ID numbers, and then we bounce that against other national databases to try and pull the cases. So if you were not seen in the VA or the DoD system, but you were seen your local office and you were diagnosed with cancer, and they provided that and they uploaded it like they're supposed to into the national and state cancer registries, then your social will show up as again, a de-identified number, and then we can identify that case. And that is where the virtual pooled registry in phase 2 will be useful to us, because that is where there's a group of states that have gotten together to provide that information to us. So I hope that answers the question. Over.
Thank you, sir. Next question is just one word, asbestos, with a question mark. Over.
That's a good question. It's one of those things that we consider. It is not part of looking at this particular study, and it was not something that we sampled. Again, as we do our current sampling, those efforts and that abatement should have been done in the past. And so again, we will look at the cancers that come out. If something drives us with our current study to look at those things in the future, then we will. Again, I want to reiterate that our current efforts are potentially a start to what we need to do. Over.
All right, we have one hand raised in the chat, and that is from Dane S. Dane, I'm asking you to go ahead and unmute yourself. If you want, go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning, gentlemen. One question I did have was if there are any mental health studies being conducted. I see that as a comorbidity, not only with the cancer issues, but with other physical, high stress, lack of sleep, just due to being on alert, odd sleep hours, that sort of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we are continuing to obviously look at in the DoD. It is outside the scope of this initial study, But again, there are other studies that are ongoing across the DoD looking at things like that, such as sleep, shift work. There's a lot of studies in the occupational environmental realm to try and look at that further. But again, outside the scope of this particular study.
All right, sir, going back to questions from the chat. This is a question about the epidemiological study. Will there be a mechanism in place in the future to validate that you are in the database with your current cancers/illnesses? Over.
The short answer is no. The longer answer is we are attempting to collect as many cases as possible, but because we use de-identified data, we don't use names or social security numbers. Our team doesn't see that information, so it's not possible for us to validate individuals, whether they are included. That's for their data protection and their individual personal record protection. But again, I'll highlight that we're using these multiple overlapping databases from multiple data sources to capture as many cases as we can. If there's particular questions, we're happy to try and answer those for individuals. But I hope that answers this individual specific question about that. Over.
All right, thank you, sir. We are coming up on 11:40, so approximately 5 minutes left to answer a few questions. We'll get through some of the quicker ones. Has anyone looked at electronic emanations, shielding, battery sets, cycling of power sources, motor generator, battery, diesel, that the missile ops crews were exposed to in the LCCs?
Yeah. So that is one thing that we're considering. Again, this often comes up in the context of those previously closed places. We have no way to evaluate those past emissions in the places that are closed and are not powered up. It is something that is in the back of our mind. Again, we are trying to figure out what cancers that we may potentially see as part of the study, and that may vector us to look at specific potential exposures. But that potential exposure specifically was not part of our environmental sampling at this point in time, but it is something that we had considered. Right.
I'll say part of our sampling plan included a series of chemicals that most of which would be captured by some of these processes. For instance, for diesel fuel, a good trademark sampling would be volatile organic compounds, which is captured in our study.
But if the question is specifically geared towards EMF or non-ionizing radiation, we did not specifically sample that at this point in time. But again, we will look at all things going forward. I do want to highlight and thank Global Strike specifically, because getting the ability to take some of our sampling meters into some of these controlled areas was no small effort. And it took a team and some specific authorization so that we could do this and that we can continue to do this in the future. Over.
Sir, you mentioned there the non-ionizing radiation exposure. There was a separate question asking about low-level radiation levels and or exposure at Minuteman missile sites. Is there a plan to undertake measurements of radiation levels? Over.
I guess I would need a little bit of clarification on the question. Are we talking about the sites where the actual weapons were? Are we talking about the LCCs where the missile operators are? It sort of depends. The 2W2s and the missile, the maintainers and the weapons that work on those are one of the most studied populations in the Air Force, and they are chronically followed already. And there's processes in place for us to continue along those lines. If the question is, do we specifically sample radiation levels at the LCCs, I guess the answer would be no. We sampled radon specifically in those areas. Over.
All right, thank you, sir. One question that we've gotten many times is, will these slides be posted online after the town hall?
Yes.
Hello.
Again, if you have a question and you'd like to
How
speak
you
out loud,
doing?
please raise your hand. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so Doc says that you have a foot problem, correct?
I do, yes.
Okay, he says you need an appointment. Can you come in and see me?
All right, have muted that individual. Sounds like they were on the line with their provider. That is bringing us to the end of our town hall. I will turn it back over to you, General Bussier. I did have to mute everyone just so we cut that conversation off so his medical privacy wasn't compromised. So in the room, if you would not mind unmuting yourselves again. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. The slides will be posted on our public-facing portal. And if you did not have the opportunity to ask a question during this forum, please either use the QR code or our website, or you can just email it to us if that's desired. I'm guessing we did not get to everybody. I'd like to close kind of where I started off in thanking everybody that's been part of this effort in this study. Thanks to the initiative and persistence of Colonel Seebeck, extending Air Force Global Strike Command and our Air Force's deepest condolences to Jenny and the Holmes family. Please know that we will continue to work as we proceed with this analysis and this study. We'll continue to work with the White House on the PAC Act and the Veterans Administration to make sure we properly document and initiate those actions to make sure our service members and their families get the services and benefits that they deserve. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to our next town hall.
Thank you, everyone. We will now be closing the meeting.